economics is a theory of competitive response. The question, what is economics, gets asked a lot, and I think it gets a lot of answers because it's not very clear. I want to bring some clarity here, and I want to relate the question of what is economics to the usefulness of economics when it comes to running a hedge fund. In other words, sometimes we have theories that are interesting, maybe descriptive, maybe not, but I think when we can have a certain purpose with that theory, and I think wealth generation is a pretty good one, then we start understanding also what the theory really is. And I also want to mention Stefan Wolfram on Lex Friedman. Again, he came back to the podcast. I just finished listening to that podcast, highly recommended. And I think Stefan is a very controversial figure, but he's a very inspiring person. He inspired me to think about the question of what is economics. He has a different approach also in terms of looking at the world. I want to talk about this a little bit. And just, I want to elaborate also on the importance of trying to see the world in different terms. Even though maybe sometimes the result could be the same, just looking at the world in different terms can give you very interesting insights. So this episode is in particular about the usefulness of economics for wealth generation. This is a Not Even Wrong podcast. It's November 11th, 2021. This is Crimdelco. Since the last update, we're up roughly 3%. The market is flat. For the year, we are up 42.8%. The market's up 21.7%. We're outperforming by 21.1%. So what is economics? The answer on my side is economics is a theory of competitive response. Now, let me elaborate a little bit. Stefan Wolfram has a theory of computation where he basically starts with a certain atom, some basic let's say some basic thing, a cellular automaton, or let's say if you look at chemistry, it would be an atom, and if you look at economics, it would be agents, people, companies, those types of things. Think of those basic atomic entities of a system, and those entities start changing based on a rule. The rule could be we add 2 and then we divide by 2, or the rule could be every time we add 2, then the lesser one survives and the bigger one dies. Or it could be any kind of rule. The point is that if we start changing the system, and time would be simply when a change occurs. So sort of using the analogy in comp sci, it would be the clock speed. So just every time we have a clock, something changes. And what's interesting in Wolfram's world is that if you look at the world that way, you start building very complex systems out of very simple rules. And this is really the core of what he calls the new kind of science. Now, what I find interesting from his perspective is that you could look at economics that way. You could say we start with agents, and then we have certain rules. We don't know what those rules are, actually, but whatever the rules are, if we could find out the rules, it would be amazing, because then we could make predictive, we could actually predict complex systems, which is something that is almost an oxymoron, but it actually would be possible if we knew the rule, but we don't know the rule, and there's a whole thing that Wolfram calls ruleology, where you actually study those rules. But that's not the topic of this podcast. What this podcast simply says is the following: that we have economic agents that behave in a certain way, and the theory of economics is the theory of competitive response. This is the key. So what we study when we study economics, when you do Econ 101 and all that stuff, is really you think about agents behaving as an answer to a change in the system, and then how do they behave when it comes to competing for resources, or competing for status, or competing for whatever. It's the theory of competitive response. Now, what does that mean? What does that really mean, theory of competitive response? Well, competition is when we have a limited amount of resources and we want more of it and others want more of it, so we compete for that. We compete for market share, we compete for status, we compete for employees, we compete for all kinds of things. This is really what economics is, and the question now is this useful? And the reason I find this incredibly useful is because this is at the core of what we have in our principal stack, which is The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen, which is a theory of competitive response in terms of disruption. So Christensen has coined his theory of disruption, his book, The Innovator's Dilemma, which is sort of the foundation of the theory of disruption, as a theory of competitive response. What is he saying? He's saying that when disruption happens, incumbents behave in a certain way. This is what he encompassed in his book, The Innovator's Dilemma, and this is what is at the core of our strategy at Orange Capital Partners. So I hope to be able to draw the line here and see and show the relevance that we attribute to to economic theory, because the theory of competitive response within the context of Clayton Christensen is just a subset of pretty much any other kind of theory that you could have in economics and that we apply when we run our hedge fund. Now, we're focused on investing in fundamentally new concepts and engineering practices with large impact. So this is our subset. But within that context, we look at competitive response. Again, competitive response is key because no matter what you do, when you allocate capital to risk, you're going to be exposed to some sort of competitive response. By the way, the competitive response could also be the response by the government. For example, what Biden is doing right now with Tesla is trying to take away resources from Tesla, trying to take away market share from Tesla by passing an EV tax credit, which is beneficial to competitors and detrimental to Tesla. So this is a theory of competitive response. How is Tesla competing within the context? How is Tesla behaving within the context of this particular action? And also how are Ford and GM and these people behaving? By the way, economics has also framed a lot of subsets of economics, institutional economics, microeconomics, macroeconomics, in order to try to capture all kinds of subsets of competitive response to different types of changes. For example, institutional economics deals with the change of laws, particularly laws. Microeconomics is more of a basic idea of, okay, how do competitive agents behave if we do things like change the price or limit the price or do price controls and things like that. But in essence, it's always a theory of competitive response. And now I want to try to elaborate why this is so important to us. And this is, again, I'm borrowing from Stefan Wolfram. Wolfram says something very interesting, which is, who is the observer? So when he looks at his theories, and he kind of asks the question, let's say if you want to use computational theory or his theory of cellular automata and apply it to biology, you kind of have to ask yourself, okay, where is the observer? Where does the rubber meet the road? Or who is making a decision of what's up, which is, who is the observer? For example, in biology, it could be a cell membrane which observes a certain change and then acts in a certain way. So immunology, the anti-gene and all these things, the surface of the particular cell, which has a certain protein, which then triggers our immune system to attack. So who is the observer? Now let's think about this in terms of economics again. Who is the observer? Well, the observer is the competitor. At least when it comes to our sort of world of where we operate in at Orange Capital Partners, what we care about is how do competitors act when something changes. This is really what we care about. And we might not state it that way explicitly. Actually, Tesla is a good example where they say, well, we don't even care about our competition. Well, that's true. You don't care about your competition, but the reason you don't care about your competition is because all your actions are such that competition doesn't even have a chance to act. So one way to act or deal with competition is to basically take them out of the equation, but that's still a way to deal with competition. To be so far ahead and to be so sophisticated and better than everybody else, the competition doesn't. That's a theory of competitive response also. And just to be clear, I want to also clarify that we have an adjustment to Clayton Christensen's theory of competitive response that he states in The Innovator's Dilemma, where he says that people in general, when they're disrupted, they're trying to do their best thing, but because of the institutional framework that they're in, so let's say the incumbent at Volkswagen or GM is doing the best they can to sell SUVs, and that's their pursuit of profit and all that stuff, and they can't therefore compete with the new entrants, the disruptor who is either going after a market that doesn't exist or going after the low end. This is what Clayton Christensen is saying. We have adapted a little bit of a different interpretation of the same concept, which is we say that the incumbents are very well aware of what's going on, and they are very well aware of, let's say, that Tesla is going after a new market, which is luxury electric cars or intelligent electric cars. The problem is they can't match the cost structure. That's the problem. That's why they're having this behavior, or they're exhibiting this behavior, which we could then interpret as kind of being almost lethargic. The problem is not that they're lethargic or lazy or complacent. They just can't, because human beings cannot adjust to lower standards of living. That applies to individuals as much as it applies to companies. Or in other words, if you want to be disruptor safe, or if you want to be, there's a lot of talk now, how can we deal with disruption? How can incumbents, blue chip companies deal with disruption? Well, one way to do it is to always be ready to lower your cost of living or standards, or in other words, never be excessive, never living gluttony, always be ready to adjust to lower costs. For example, we stated also several times that the biggest risk we see for Tesla, other than the Biden administration and all the political stuff that's going on within the US, is actually Chinese competition, because they come from a low-cost base. And the way Tesla can deal with this is to have a stated strategy of continuously driving down cost. And we said that this was a year ago when they had their battery day, that the $25,000 car is a response to the threat of Chinese competition, Chinese low-cost competition. This is what we stated. We still believe in that. It hasn't been stated like that explicitly by Tesla, but that's fine. We don't need to have that explicitly. For us, internally at Orange Capital Partners, this is a good milestone to see that Tesla is doing exactly what we expect them to do. And this is, I think, where the theory of competitive response comes in, or where economic theory, the way we understand it, comes in. So for all the people out there, and the purpose of this podcast is to give people a sense for what it feels like to run a hedge fund. So please take a few things very seriously. This is our advice. One is, if you study economics, or if you don't, then please go and study at least some of it. If you do study, make it a science of competitive response. Look at it from that perspective, and all of a sudden what we call the dismal science will become very clear. It will become very applicable to the purpose of wealth generation. Everything you do, you learn all the basics in economics, all that stuff. If you think about it from the concept of competitive response, how do people act when laws change? How does the competitive nature of a certain industry change? How does the competitive nature of an industry change when there's a technological innovation? This is the theory of growth. I forgot who it is. It wasn't Ricardo. I think somebody else. Romer, I think. Keynes. If you have the government sucking resources out of the economy and diluting the competitive situation within the economy, what does that mean for you as a competitor? No matter how you look at it, no matter which theory you look at it, if you look at the theories within economics from the concept of the competitive response, all of a sudden they become very applicable. Not all of them, but a lot of them. In fact, things like behavioral economics all of a sudden becomes less relevant. And I think this is one of the biggest fallacies actually in my career as a student and graduate student in economics and business, was that I thought that the psychology and all the stuff that Kahneman and Tversky did would be much more useful than it actually turned out to be, because it really doesn't capture what we call the theory of competitive response, or it hasn't been able to penetrate that part of what we see as relevant. And this is what really counts when it comes to wealth generation. So to summarize, this episode was really an inspiration and answer, reaction episode to the Stephen Wolfram podcast between Stephen Wolfram and Lex Friedman. Shout out to Lex Friedman. Wolfram is a pretty controversial figure, and I have a lot of question marks, like everybody else, about his, comparing himself to Newton and things like that. It's just, he just goes way too far when it comes to ego and all that. But that's fine. I think the price you pay is worth it, because he has this inspirational power. And one thing that inspired me is to think about what is economics, and I came up with this answer for myself, and now I want to share it, which is economics is the theory of competitive response. So I'm actually stating that I'm extrapolating from Christensen's theory of disruption, which is really what economics is. Economics is the idea of what happens when you get disrupted, because Christensen only looks at it from a technological disruption point of view. For example, an application of Christensen would be, okay, what is going on within the pharma space now with CRISPR? We have a new technology which allows low-cost entrants to come in and do 10 times better with 10 times less cost, things like that. But you could have disruption in many other ways, political, you could have disruption socially. There's a lot of different types of disruption, and the question is always, what is the theory of competitive response? So if we start looking at economics from that angle, all of a sudden it becomes a lot more useful for wealth generation. This is the purpose of this particular episode, to convey to people that economics looked at the angle from competitive response can become incredibly useful for the theory of wealth generation, or for the practice, of wealth generation. And I'm very thankful that I've been able to navigate this space for now more than 20 years. So I did my undergrad in economics. I did a graduate school in business at Chicago, which was kind of a obviously very economic laden also. And then I've been in the business of investing risk capital for ever since Wall Street, and since about 13 years at Orange Capital Partners. So over all this time, I've always struggled with the idea, what has been the use of economics for me? And I came to the conclusion that the use of economics is first and foremost as a tool, as a theory of competitive response. This is where it is incredibly useful for us, and I suggest that it is also very useful for everybody else. And I'd be open for a conversation about this, for new input, new ideas. So please put on your comments if you have ideas. I think this is a very important milestone for myself, because finally I've been able to formulate what the purpose of economics is when it comes to wealth generation. Thank you.